Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews, with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about the review copy I received of Onerat Pty Limited's Eldritch-soaked adventure, Elden, Path of the Forgotten. Find out if I thought Path was a title worth traversing, or if its journey was ultimately forgettable. Heeding the call of forbidden knowledge, a woman finds herself delving into matters too twisted for the mortal mind. Something which not only sees her whisked away by unhallowed forces, but besets the countryside with all sorts of aberrations. Her son, left in the wake of her reckless actions, now struggles to navigate this blighted landscape, desperately attempting an exodus across this now twisted reality in the hopes that he can be reunited with her once more. Anyways, as far as story beats go, I'm fairly sure I got the broad strokes right. At least. That said, given the story is provided to players in the form of a sparse handful of animated cutscenes, there's a lot that's left open to interpretation, especially when it comes to the game's dialogue, since, the entirety of it is written in a peculiar sort of code, which quite literally needs decoding to make heads or tails of what's being said. And, spoilers, I never figured it out, so I went through the entirety of the game without any idea of what's going on. And no, according to the dev, you never actually find a way to automatically decode these small bits of dialogue while playing, or even like a Rosetta Stone of sorts. So good luck with your code cracking. The game's idiosyncrasies aren't merely limited to its storytelling choices either. See, Elden is an adventure title, but one that focuses less on the idea of exploration and more on its stamina-based combat and the general sense of discovery it tries to elicit from players through its obtuse mechanics. Part of why I say this is because the player is thrust into its world with little preamble and a complete lack of tutorials, which meant that I found myself needing to crack open the game's control manual to actually get a good bearing on everything I could or couldn't do. Which, be mindful of that choice, since the cancel button also happens to double as the quit game key instead of backing out of the menu. So I reflexively did that a couple times. That isn't the crux of it, however, as this lack of transparency also extends to the game's usable items, which is to say, whilst you can certainly accrue weapons and spells alongside a range of usable items, they're completely lacking in descriptions, obliging you to discover their usage and limits strictly through trial and error. In the case of items, this feels especially daunting given there's a finite number of them to be found, which can make the usage of one at an inappropriate time feel especially awful. Especially if you're to squander one of the few poison antidotes in the game, especially before you reach an area with poison. The optional spells you can acquire aren't quite as prohibitive in their use, but considering just how quickly they burn through your mana reserves and how slowly that resource regenerates, they still end up feeling like a nuisance to experiment with, which can make figuring out the ins and outs of those spells a slow-going process, especially with the later ones. The weapons, at least, are a lot easier to figure out, as the default longsword and the optional action spear have fairly limited movesets to work with. Honestly, I don't have much to say about the sword, as it's a decent all-rounder, but I had a hell of a time with the axe. Partly because I played before the recent patch, which improved the axe's range, which made it a disconcertingly precise weapon with a slow wind-up. It still remains slow, and given the game has a counterattack system where hitting the enemy in their wind-up animation does bonus damage, I found myself preferring the spear. Sure, it's got a slender hitbox and can't attack diagonally, but it's got excellent range alongside decent damage and speed. Which, on its own, this is more than powerful enough to effectively eviscerate enemies, but this is only the beginning of its true power, provided you're willing to abuse the overall idiocy of your enemies. See, if you happen to kite your foe stand up on the other side of an object from you, they'll keep trying to run through it while you hunker down and honeycomb them with holes, which, I found myself increasingly justified in doing as I progressed through the game, given the sheer droves of enemies expected me to exterminate, over and over again. Whilst each new area does add new types to engage, you'll also find yourself plagued by familiar faces. It's also probably why I was so fond of the game's 3 boss encounters, as they each felt very different from each other, both visually as well as the array of abilities they have at their disposal. Like, their sheer strength made them daunting to encounter, and they were durable enough that I was all but obliged to figure out their mechanics. Though, the first boss's paralyzing orb mechanic can rot in hell, and the reappearance of it as an arbitrary obstacle in later stages is complete cancer. Still, as much as I've talked a lot about the game's combat, I did begin to find it a bit exhausting as I continued to progress forward through the stages. Part of that, no doubt, is that there was little intrinsic value in fighting the various creatures other than to get them out of the way. Like sure, engaging them when they were fresh was neat, but there's no progression system in the game, making their sheer abundance exhausting. What's more, just running away from them was made difficult for a number of reasons. For one thing, they're fucking fastidious and will relentlessly pursue you until you manage to get them wedged on an obstacle. But even the act of getting away is tricky, given your basic walking speed is sad and your running speed is pathetic, and further compounded by how fast it drains your stamina, it's literally more efficient to travel by dodge rolling. But even then, that represents a danger, given just how slowly your stamina recovers, especially if you happen to get ambushed by an array of alien enemies. Basically, this is my alibi for why murder became my best option. At least the enemies stay dead so long as you find a checkpoint tile or progress to a new area, though there were times where I found myself unable to indulge in that course of action due to the attack button becoming unresponsive, which made the whole surviving thing a major problem. And it would persist until I exited the game, which frequently made traveling to the next checkpoint fraught. Beyond all that, however, I think the only other gameplay element I really feel the need to touch upon is my singular wish that there was more of a reason to explore in the game. The areas you travel are somewhat sprawling, but they're mostly just stabathons that are loosely populated with consumables to collect. So at least it meant the complete lack of a map system wasn't quite as egregious. Also, while the game doesn't have any maps to peer at, and only possesses a basic UI, it's still quite pleasing to the eye. The animated scenes, which serve as both intro and outro, were a treat to witness, and the overall enemy and boss designs are rather nice to look at. And like I mentioned earlier, I was quite fond of the bosses. The protagonist running animation is a bit janky though. That said, I personally found the game's sound design served to contribute the most towards building a more creepy vibe, at least when it comes to the music. It helped a lot towards building ambience as you journey through the various stages. On this front, I can only make minor nitpick that when ranged enemies spam their attacks at you, it can get a little bit annoying, but when paired up alongside the disconcerting sounds of the enemy's grunts, groans, and distant shufflings, I found myself able to forgive the game for this. But that said and done, this brings us to the conclusion of today's review. For those who've seen my reviews before, you might be aware of my fondness for Eldritch horror and infused malarkey, and on that front, I can't say I had any qualms with the narrative light approach the game took for its storyline. The world you're introduced to is mysterious and infinitely hostile, and it doesn't want to give you clear-cut answers. It's not a bad idea, really, and it helps to leave the ultimate outcome of the game a bit more open-ended to how it can be interpreted, though I wish there was a more accessible way to decipher the in-game cipher. And likewise, its approach to its visual and sound design felt generally on point. There's actually some decent little moments of environmental or situational storytelling that crop up and have an impact even without a single line of dialogue being spoken. But I really wasn't enamored with the gameplay. I won't fault it for its lack of transparency, it wasn't a major hindrance. That said, for a combat-focused title, it allowed the enemy encounters to devolve into slogs. Your repertoire and combat capabilities stay fairly consistent through the crux of the game, and whilst the opposition slowly introduces new elements, I still found myself dealing with a lot of the same things over and over again. Each area would invariably begin to drag on, enemies devolving into fleshy speed bumps. The shrug-worthy exploration elements didn't help either. Honestly, it made me infinitely grateful for the bosses, since they represented such a different experience from everything else I'd ended up facing off, and were sources of my most memorable moments within the game. Still, at the end of my 3.5 hours with Elden Path, and with the credits rolling by, my feelings were left a bit ambivalent as to whether or not I'd recommend this to someone. It's definitely a mixed bag, and I feel like I'd primarily only be able to recommend it to someone craving an odd take on a Lovecraftian adventure and a more ambient stab at storytelling. Which is ultimately why I'd rate it as a fumble. It's not bad, but I certainly wouldn't play it again unless a serious amount of content were to be added. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And for those interested in more indie reviews, developer interviews, podcasts, or our Monday TTRPG content that will one day return, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord. You can click the link in the banner or description so you can be part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a Ko-fi running now to help supplement funds for a lovely editor and make sure we can continue to provide quality content. Again, check the description and the banner for them links. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.